So, I I did my presentation on forced labor at Opel and Ford Worka. So, Opel started as a German bicycle and sewing machine maker. However, in 1899, the company began producing automobiles, and by the 1920s, Opel was the largest European car maker. There were roughly 13,000 employees working in an assembly line, but due to poor sanitation, safety hazards, arbitrary penalties, low wages, and just generally the market situation, the factory began producing below capacity and caused Opel to go into debt in 1928. In 1929, however, GM purchased 80% of Opel's shares, and 2 years later, in 1931, GM purchased the remaining 20% of Opel's shares, making GM the sole owner of Opel. So after GM purchased Opel, domestic sales of cars tripled by 1938, so roughly 85,000 units compared to an average of about 24,000 units in 1929 to 1933. Exports rose from about 800 in 1934 to more than 33,000 in 1938, and Opel's operating profit shot up from a loss of nearly $3 million in 1930 to a peak of almost $14 million in 1938. In this period, GM doubled its plant investment, raising employment to about 20,000 people. So, on January 5th, 1925, Ford AG was started in Berlin. At first, vehicle parts were shipped in from Denmark and assembled in Germany, but in 1926, a warehouse was rented in a suburb of Berlin, and that site became the main assembly plant as well as the corporate headquarters for Ford AG. Truck assembly began in April 1926, and Model Ts followed in June of the same year. Ford built the Ford Worka factory in Cologne in 1931, and 3 years later, its revenues rose by 400% during 1934 to 1938. However, in 1933, the Nazi Party restricted currency remittances to foreign countries. Therefore, Ford's profits had to be used in Germany. So, Ford expanded on the production plant and installed high-end machinery from the US, and the Cologne plant was ranked as the second most advanced auto factory in Europe. Ford Worka's passenger cars were ranked 4th in the German market, and the trucks were in second just after Opel, so they were doing pretty well. So the Treaty of Versailles caused Germany to have an economic depression and resulted in 6 million unemployed workers. And during all of this, on January 30th, 1933, Hitler was named Chancellor, and in 1934, the Nazis had completely taken over all political, social, and economic factors. So Opel enters this whole picture in 1935, where it starts producing arms for the military, and in September 1939, Hitler's invasion of Poland caused Great Britain and France to declare war on Germany, which started World War II, and in February of 1940, Opel began building parts for combat aircraft for Germany. So, due to this intense demand of products, Opal had an extreme labor shortage, especially since most of the skilled workers had been drafted into the military. Um, Opal had managed with a huge intensive lobbying effort to get back uh, some skilled workers, but military recruiters still demanded 100 men for the front. A week later, like 200, then 400, and then Opal claimed that it couldn't guarantee on-time delivery of parts unless they had additional workers come to their plants. Um, the other problem was that some of the German workers complained about 11-hour shifts, which were due to make up for labor shortages, and wages had been frozen due to the war. Um, so the SS began um, delivering French, Belgian, and Russian prisoners of war to Opel to use as forced laborers um, due to these labor shortages and to get more products out on the front line. So the reason why they turned to prisoners of war instead of using civilian workers was because originally during the labor shortage, Opel recruited civilian workers from occupied France, Holland, Belgium, Italy, and other places. And the civilians had complained about poor lodgings, and as a result, they had a high turnover and many didn't return from holidays. Um, and there was also like a high escape rate at another facility where trucks were being built, and roughly half of these civilian workers had disappeared during their first 3 months of deployment. Um, and also, an important note is that by May of 1941, no Americans that were working for GM and Opel were left because Germany had declared war on the US. So, as the war did go on, Ford also had labor shortage problems as well. They lost a lot of their German workforce due to the draft and began using French, Russian, and Italian prisoners of war in 1942. So there were three main sources for forced recruits. The first were labor offices for civilian workers from occupied countries. Um, the second was a prison camp system for prisoners of war. And the third was the SSWVHA, basically a bureaucratic administration and economic agency of the SS, and that was used to get concentration camp prisoners. Um, so, yeah, there were three categories of foreign workers considered by the Nazis. The first were Western workers, so it was like French, Belgian, Dutch workers. They were treated generally like German workers and obviously got an equal amount of pay. There were no restrictions whatsoever, really, with these workers. However, Polish workers had to wear a large square yellow insignia with the letter P on it. Their pay depended on whatever the wage scale was in Germany, and there were also a few restrictions on which public places they could go and what sort of transport they could use. Lastly, there were Russian and Ukrainian workers. They wore a blue square with an O on it. They received barely any spending money at all, and they weren't permitted at all to enter any stores or public places and basically treated as subhuman. Along with being constantly monitored and treated as subhuman by the security forces, prisoners were also forced to work 12-hour shifts and were served barely any food, like 2 pieces of bread with coffee for breakfast, um, potatoes, soup, and occasionally a plate of lentils for dinner. And as a result, majority of these prisoners became sick due to the intensity of the work and the lack of nutrition. In general, also, companies who use prisoners of war as laborers were also required to maintain their own separate barrack, guarded by company security forces. Opel completed building theirs in July 1940, and they were sent 600 French and Belgian prisoners from another camp, and Opel had been told to pay each new prisoner 80% of the regional average wage of a German per month. And instead of doing that, Opel deducted its prisoners' wages to pay for lodging and food and for the additional security. So in the book that I read for this presentation, Working for the Enemy, there were a couple of interviews from survivors. One of them was Fritz Thielen, who had an apprenticeship and witnessed forced laborers and Ford Worka being mistreated. Thielen and his friends would leave soup out for the younger workers, and had witnessed security guards pushing these young workers' faces into the bowls of soup if they weren't quick enough. And he also had witnessed some Hitler Youth or young SS men come and kick and beat forced laborers if they even slowed down while working. Also in the same book, it also shows the little luck that some of these laborers had. Anna Nesteruk, who was also a forced laborer at Ford Worka, was occasionally fed pieces of bread or like buttered rolls by German supervisors. After the war, roughly 7.7 million forced laborers became displaced and awaited by the thousands to be transported home. There was still also extremely high tension between these displaced laborers and the Germans, which resulted in frequent attacks and destruction of civilian homes or machinery. Western European forced laborers were returned to their home countries after roughly a month, and fortunately accepted by their families, friends, and their countries, but Eastern European forced laborers, under Stalinist reasoning, were basically sent to the gulags because they had been quote unquote collaborating with the enemy. Even if they were forced to, they were still considered like traitors. As for the companies involved, their actions under Nazi control violated the 1929 Geneva Convention, which prohibits the use of prisoners of war as laborers in military production, and the treatments of the prisoners of war also violated the Geneva Convention's requirement of due respect for their persons and dignity. In 1998, a few actually, of the major German industrial corporations set up compensation funds for Nazi-era forced labor. But as for Ford and GM, they didn't pay any penalty, despite helping to arm Nazi regime and their use of forced laborers, because they claimed that their companies were seized by German authorities at the beginning of the war. And here are a couple of my references that I used.